Perfect. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming on back to our next installment of Accessibility Adventure. If this is your first time with us, we have been learning for the last couple months all things accessibility and inclusivity when it comes to what goes on in our classrooms. So we are so excited to be here with you again this month, where we are going to take representation and we're going to take it a step further and discuss some strategies and how we can address representation in our practices. So thanks for tuning in. My name is John Pauls. I am a learning experience designer and professor from Jacksonville, Florida. I am joined by the fabulous Kristen Harrington, a virtual learning coordinator and author here in Florida as well. You'll hear from her in just a bit. We are both professional learning specialists with the Northwest Council of Computer Education. The Northwest Council of Computer Education is the premier educational technology professional learning network. We have a conference. We have a nationwide network of active practitioners and teachers that are willing to share their expertise and their strategies with all of you. If you're in a school district or an organization who may need some support, whether it comes to blended learning strategies or technology innovation or accessibility or artificial intelligence, NCCE has people that they can pair you with to support those transitions. So if you're interested, be sure to head to www.ncce.org and fill out our little contact form, and somebody will be in touch with you to see how we can help service you and your educators. So thanks for tuning in. Now, we always like to start these sessions where we can frame our conversations. It's really important to think about the why behind what we're talking about. So let's go ahead and dive into that conversation. When we talk about accessibility, we do so because accessibility is important, but accessibility does take intentional effort. It doesn't just happen naturally, and providing access is always going to be worth that investment. So that's why we're all here today, to talk about some strategies that you can implement in your practices that increase the accessibility in your classes and in your designs. As educators, we must refrain from protecting and preserving traditional keys to learning. We have to become the swipe cards. What that means is keys usually just work for one lock. One key, one lock, one solution. But if we adapt and become the swipe cards, we can reprogram our teaching practices to meet everybody. So internalize that, think about that, and let's all become swipe cards to make sure that we're providing access to everybody. You are in our May installment. We have been meeting for the last several months, all the way since December, from 7 to 8, once per month. This is our second to last time with all of you. We have a tiny URL, t.ly/_, capital V, lowercase y, 52. The QR code is on your screen if you want to use your mobile device. That will take you to a website with all of our previous recordings. So if you want to go back, if this is your first time with us and you want to learn more about engagement or representation or action and expression, you can go back and watch those recordings. Today, we're going to take representation, take what we talked about in February, and we're going to expand upon it with some additional insights. So you are so welcome if this is your first time with us, but I do encourage you to go on back and check out our recordings. Next month will be our last month with you all this school year, where we were going to take action and expression and expand that. So we hope that you will be able to join us next month, because together we are going to explore how we provide access to everyone in our own work and in our own worlds. Now, before we begin it to representation, we want to take just a second to situate our own identity. And what that means is we want to think about what makes us us. So you may think about maybe your hair color, your eyesight, maybe how you look, maybe how you identify. Think about your learners. How do they identify? What is their identity? For some people, their identity includes disabilities, both seen and unseen. And so how can we honor those identities? How can we honor the different identities of our multicultural learners? All of this comes into practice when we talk about representation in our classrooms. And in addressing representation, we make our classes a little bit more accessible and inclusive, which is a fantastic thing in 2025. It's important to know that identity is a complex and multi-dimensional concept that shapes how we see ourselves and how we see others. How I interact with people in my world is very much based on my own personal identity. How you identify with others and how you interact in the world is based on your identity. So how do we address the identities of our students in our classrooms? How do we support those identities? How do we tell our learners that they belong? How do we create learning experiences that honors those identities? We'll talk a little bit about that today. Our identity informs how we show up in the world around us, and our learner's identity should also inform how we design their learning. The last several months, we have been taking an approach where we look at the Universal Design for Learning framework, known as UDL. This framework really helps us identify ways that we can adjust our current instructional practices to make things more inclusive and accessible for our learners. And it's really not too hard of a concept. When we look at our framework, you'll see some of our guidelines. It just kind of makes sense. And you may be doing some of these, and you're doing it because you're a fantastic teacher, but maybe you don't realize that it is an accessibility feature as well. So we're going to take a look a little bit at the Universal Design for Learning framework now. Those UDL guidelines that we're going to talk about, they are a tool used in the implementation of Universal Design for Learning, which is a framework developed by CAST to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. So what we talk about today is based on science. It's based on what we know, based on years and years and years of research into how people learn. You can implement all of these strategies that we talk about today, whether you have learners who may have a disability or not. What we talk about today is good for so many learners. So you're in the right place regardless of whom you teach. The Universal Design for Learning framework splits up the framework into these guidelines where we can address designing multiple means of engagement, designing multiple means of representation, and designing multiple means of action and expression. If you've never viewed the UDL guidelines, make sure to go to https://udlguidelines.cast.org. You'll find a wealth of information, the evidence behind why they have designed this framework and how the framework works. So I encourage you to check that out and maybe start seeing how you can implement some of these strategies in your own practices. When we talk about UDL, we have things, and some of the times the terminology can get a little tricky, but when we talk about the principle, that's when we're talking about designing multiple means of representation, action and expression, engagement. And then those principles are broken up into guidelines where it lays out exactly what it means to address that principle. So for instance, on the screen in front of you is an image of some of those principles, design multiple means of representation. And the first level, it splits it up into a guideline that says design options for perception. And then it goes into some considerations under that guideline that tells us exactly what that looks like. So in this instance, designing options for perception, the considerations include supporting opportunities to customize display of information, supporting multiple ways to perceive information, and to represent a diversity of perspectives and identities in authentic ways. So we're going to look at representation a little bit more in depth today. This is just one of the concepts in the UDL guideline. And so under designing multiple means of representation, we have three quadrants. We have the access quadrant, which is designing options for perception. How do our students perceive the learning environment, perceive the instructional materials? How do they perceive the activities? It's all about how they take in the learning that we are trying to facilitate in our classroom. That is the bare minimum. We're allowing our students to access the learning experience, but we can advance that to support our learners by designing options for language and symbols, the next area. And finally, if we have provided access and we have supported learning, we can foster executive functioning skills where we can design options for building knowledge. In this area, designing multiple means of representation, we need to address how we design learning experiences that allow students to access the learning process, how do we support their learning journey, and how do we design experiences that encourage the development of those executive functioning skills. On the screen in front of you is the UDL framework where we have designed multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. And you can see a bunch of the quadrants and how it is described in each area. How do we provide access in these areas? How do we support learning in these areas? And how do we encourage executive functioning? It's important to know that the goal of UDL is learner agency. We want them to be able to advocate for themselves. We want our learners to be able to engage in instructional materials independently. We want them to live as independent of lives outside of our classrooms as possible. So that goal of learner agency is purposeful and reflective, resourceful and authentic, strategic and action-oriented. That is why CAST developed the UDL guidelines, and that is why it's super important that we consider implementing these strategies in our classes. Now, and you are welcome if you're joining us to put this in the chat. If you are joining asynchronously afterwards, you can actually put this on social media. Make sure to mention at NCCE EdTech and hashtag IMNCCE. We'll see that. We'll be able to respond and see your contributions. But I want you just to reflect about your own practices. You walk into the classroom, you're designing learning, you are getting ready for your day. How do you currently design for multiple means of representation in our learning? Do your learners see themselves represented in your materials and in your practices? And if so, what does that have to do with their identity? And why is it important? These are all things that are really important to consider when we are designing instruction, especially in 2025. Our students are so diverse with all kinds of different needs and possibilities and capabilities. And if we use something like the UDL guidelines, it really helps us cast a huge wide net that is more likely to capture all students. And so we're going to take a look a little bit into designing multiple means of representation. Now, if we were to break this down, the design multiple means of representation, we have, again, that access, the support, and the executive functioning level. And it's important to note, we always start with the access. If our students can't access the experience, we can't get to anything else. So we first need to ensure our students can access the learning experience. Once they have that access, we can move on to supporting their learning. And then hopefully at the graduation of this learning experience, they have developed executive functioning skills related to the topic that they can take out into their community and their personal lives. Now, we are not going to look at all of these areas because that would take multiple hours of discussions. But if you want to go back and look at our previous videos, especially on representation, we do go into things a little bit deeper. Tonight, we're going to look at some specific strategies where we pick one of the areas that I personally think may be easier for all of us to achieve that may make it a little bit more inclusive and accessible in our classes. And then we'll look at some examples of what that might look like. So for designing multiple means of representation, the areas that we can address is we can design options for perception. How do our students perceive the information that we are presenting? They need to be able to perceive the information or they can't internalize it. They can't connect those neurons. They can't have that learning. And so how do we ensure everybody in our classes perceives the desired information effectively? Some ways that UDL tells us we can do that is by supporting opportunities to customize the display of information. And we may talk about this a little later. When we talk about that, it's really using digital technology to really enhance the learning experience. So if a learner needs to adjust their computer screen because of some vision considerations, our learners know how to do that. The materials that we design allow them to do that. We also need to support multiple ways to perceive information. And we're talking about more than just a worksheet and a traditional static book. That works for some students. It does not work for everyone. So how are we supporting all learners by designing multiple ways to perceive information? And then finally, in this area, representing a diversity of perspectives and identities in authentic ways. So how do our learners know via our learning experiences, our materials, and our approaches that it is a diverse experience? How are their perspectives, their lives, their identities represented in the learning experience to make those really important connections? So when I think about this, when I was working on this and trying to come up with some tips and some best practices, I thought about the following. Digital content is a huge help. I am a big advocate of using learning management systems, of making things digital that can be digital. Because if I am using a worksheet and a physical book, it is very hard for me to enlarge the text in a physical book. I could get a magnifying glass, or there are some tools and strategies, but does every classroom have those tools? When I think about translation services, I can't easily translate a worksheet or a textbook, but I can translate digital content. I can show my learners how to access accessibility features on the computer to allow them a more accessible experience to perceive instructions. So the first thing I thought about is making our content digital so that we can use those tools to enhance our learning. It's not enough to just make things digital, though. We have to be intentional in showing our learners where and how to access those accessibility features. And so taking time out of your instruction to show all learners, this is where you can get your settings on the computer to adjust text size. This is where you can find translation and how you do that. Taking time out to build resources or explicitly explain how to do these things to all of your learners, one, makes it not as stigmatizing as if I were to just show Joey how to use the text adjusting features on the computer, or Susie how to use translation. But if I show all can benefit and use if they need it. We can also embrace multisensory learning. And when I talk about multisensory learning, I talk about engaging all of your senses when you're learning. I think about YouTube videos where my visuals and the auditory stimulus is adding additional insight into what I'm learning. I think about podcasts, which hone into that auditory part of my learning process. I think about the importance of visuals on my instructional materials that help process the information versus just text alone. I even think about project-based learning that allows my students to use their hands or to use physical creation methods to demonstrate learning. Not everyone is going to learn in an optimal way the same. And so the more that we can vary our learning approaches and our materials, the more likely we are going to have all students successful in accessing it. And I also think about those multi-format resources, offering multiple formats of information. If I have a research paper I want my learners to read, that's fantastic. But can I take that research paper and make a podcast? Can I get a YouTube video that discusses the same things that research paper does? If I can do that, if I can offer those multiple formats, I am creating a more accessible learning space for my students. So let's take a look at some examples of what this might look like. Let's say I was teaching a student about the scientific method. On the video that is playing on your screen is from Google Notebook LM. That is a free resource that you can access that allows you to take text or documents or websites and turn them into a variety of resources, including an auditory podcast. So if I'm teaching my learners about the scientific method and I'm just using text, I am one method of interacting with that concept. But if I take that text,
getting into the scientific that core process for figuring things out. Exactly. We've got some.
If I take that text and I move it over to Google Notebook LM, for example, and create a podcast, you just heard those hosts talking. They're going to go on for 4 minutes and 30 seconds discussing the scientific method. And it took me maybe a minute and a half to generate that output using Google Notebook's artificial intelligence. And so in the age of AI, we have far fewer excuses to make learning more accessible. If I can take my instructional materials and go to Google Notebook LM and make a podcast, I am adding an additional format of learning for my students that is going to make things more accessible. In Google Notebook LM, I can also take that content and create frequently asked questions, a study guide, a timeline, depending on the topic you're using, and a briefing document. So if we want to synthesize the concept that we are discussing into more bite-sized parameters, we can all have that generated with artificial intelligence in a matter of minutes. This is the power of this technology innovation, especially with artificial intelligence. We have the capability to save time, be more productive, and make things more accessible if we just put in that initial effort. So whereas I might have just had that paper on the scientific method, I can now go and get a podcast. I can get an outline of the history of the scientific method. I can have a frequently asked questions or a study guide. All of these additional resources I can place into my learning management system, making things more accessible for my learners. If you have not checked out Google Notebook LM, I do highly encourage you to do so. It is one easy way for you to cast that wider net to diversify the content that you present in your classes without any additional work on your part, and it's going to make things much more accessible for your learners. Now, the next area we discuss with multiple means of representation is designing options for languages and symbols. We know our learners come to us with a diverse background. We have some English language learners where English may not be their strongest suit. We may have neurodivergent learners who may be non-speaking, who rely on our symbol communication to engage with our content. Symbols and language are super important in 2025. And so in UDL, we address that by clarifying vocabulary, symbols, and language structures, by supporting the decoding of text, mathematical notation, and symbols, by cultivating understanding and respect across those languages and dialects, by addressing biases in the use of language and symbols, and illustrating through multiple media. Now, for this one, let's talk about addressing biases in the use of language and symbols. I think sometimes we can have an inherent bias when it comes to how we present content. We assume that we speak English and we are able to speak and we are able to have that receptive communication. So we may take that for granted, and we don't understand that not all of our learners may have those same level of abilities. So if we were to address the biases that we have and maybe our school systems have in the use of language and symbols, we can make things more accessible and inclusive. So this might look like modeling accessible language and communication in your own practices. You may have heard on previous screens, I would auditorily describe some of the images that we were seeing. This is one way that I can address my own bias of assuming that everybody is seeing what is on the screen. And I know that some people may not be seeing what's on the screen. Some people may have a vision consideration. Some people may be washing the dishes and trying to listen at the same time. And so me giving that auditory description of what is on the screen just makes things a little bit more accessible. And you can do that in your classes too. If you have a slide up and you're talking to your learners, taking just a couple seconds to describe that image that's on the screen for your learners, cast that wider net. I also think it's really important that we use symbols to accompany written concepts when appropriate. So if we're talking about lab safety, maybe you're teaching chemistry and you have your little signs that you have around the chemistry lab about what is dangerous and where to get support and where the hand washing station is. Do we use those symbols in our instruction so our students and our learners are equating that symbol with the meaning? Do we incorporate visuals as much as possible when we're describing concepts or themes in order to cast that wider net to engage those neurons in our brain? If we were to use those symbols, we are addressing the needs of some of our neurodivergent learners. We are providing support to our English language learners. We're just adding another layer of understanding to what we're trying to present. Subtitles for media, I think that is super important as well. So if you are listening, if you're presenting, using some of those subtitle features, making sure all of your videos that you use in your courses have subtitles, getting into that default response of understanding that subtitles are important and that they are an accessibility feature, and getting in the practice and habit of making sure they're enabled is vital. Now, you're not going to be perfect all the time. There are times where I forget when I'm presenting, oh, make sure I've got those subtitles, make sure I've got the captioning. It's not a get it right all the time type of situation. This is going to take time for you to practice these skills and to get in the habit of implementing these accessibility practices. So please don't feel less than or anything like that if you occasionally forget. The goal is continued improvement and moving the needle forward. So get in the habit of using subtitles for your media. Provide transcripts for the content that you present. If you record a welcome introduction video in your learning management system, is there captioning? If not, put a transcript in there. There are so many artificial intelligence enabled platforms that will give you that transcript pretty automatically. I would just encourage you to do a simple Google search and find which tool is free and supports your own goals. And then teaching our students to use translation services and then you using them yourself. I think back to when I was in elementary school teaching, I had students whose parents and families were not English speakers. And so using Microsoft Translator, I could have conversations with my parents and my families to make sure that they are included and everything that everybody else is included in. Taking your newsletter that you may have created in Google Docs and using the translation feature to translate to different languages based on the needs of your students. Those are all pretty simple steps that we can take to make sure everything is inclusive for our learners. I encourage you to explore some of those options and to practice implementing them in your daily practice. But let's take a look at what this could look like. I'm a big fan of using Canva. If you're an educator in K through 12, Canva is completely free for you. So you can go to canva.com and figure out the education login. You will get Canva Pro for free. So if you have not invested, go ahead and check that out. But in Canva, you can create videos, PowerPoints, slide decks. You can create social media graphics, newsletters. There are millions of templates that you can use in your instructional practices. And what I love about Canva is they have millions of pictures and images related to anything you can think of. So you don't have to go to the internet and figure out, let me find this image, because John said I need to have images on my slides when I'm talking. If you build it in Canva, you can find a ton of applicable images in your practices. You can also find that Canva, if I'm recording a video in Canva, it has automatic captioning as well. So if we think about how we're supporting our learners, using something like Canva for visuals and to ensure that our captions are on our media is one huge step to making learning more accessible for our students. And it also addresses any biases in the use of languages and symbols. If you model for your peers and for your students and for your PLC, if you model these best practices, you're addressing the bias. You're standing up and saying, nope, my students are worth it. I'm going to make sure I'm casting a wide net. I'm doing what I know needs to be done to make sure everyone can understand what I'm talking about and apply it to their own lives. And then when we talk about executive functioning in the area of designing multiple means of representation, we're talking about how do we support our learners build their own knowledge? How do we not only connect prior knowledge to new learning? How do we highlight and explore patterns in the learning? How do we explore critical features, big ideas, relationships? How do we cultivate multiple ways of knowing and making meaning? And how do we maximize the ultimate goal of transferring and generalizing the information learned in your class to the outside world? In this area, let's take a look at cultivate multiple ways of knowing and making meaning. As an instructional designer in higher education, I work with faculty to design their courses. And a lot of our faculty may not have an education background. And so when they come to me and they are coaching and we're designing and we are creating, I discuss the concept that a multiple choice test or fill in the blank is probably not the best way to assess learning for our students. There are so many different ways that we can provide evidence of learning, and I encourage you to explore those. So if we are exploring multiple ways of knowing and making meaning, we can have that written evidence because sometimes writing is exactly what we need. We want you to write and tell us what you know. But sometimes using video evidence, having our students record a video or demonstration of their knowledge is appropriate. Sometimes tactile evidence, having a student create, build, construct, that may be most appropriate. Oral evidence, can a student talk to you and tell you exactly what they know? And then collective evidence, I think about that as a portfolio or a collection of evidence through the semester. All of these are different approaches. They're going to speak to different students. But if we look at our students and we look at our learners, that multiple choice question, that fill in the blank, it's going to work for some, it's not going to work for all. And at the end of the day, we want to know what you know. Have you learned? Do you understand? And there are multiple ways that we can assess that. So I encourage you to think outside of the box. When I think about this, one of my favorite ways recently is to use something like Google Slides or Microsoft PowerPoint or even a Canva slide deck to create a portfolio. You don't have to have a portfolio software. You don't have to pay anything special. But as a teacher, I can create a template that contains all of the activities for a module or a unit or even an entire year if you want, and create embedded opportunities throughout that PowerPoint for my learners to engage. Using something like PowerPoint or Google Slides, I can embed videos. I can embed audio. I can go in and share this document between my learner and myself, and I can see them working in real time. I can provide comment and coaching. I can even differentiate in this portfolio experience for each learner. So if I know that Timmy is not the best writer, and I'm teaching social studies, so I want to focus on the topics. Maybe in Timmy's portfolio, I structure some different learning experiences. Everybody else, they don't need to know that Timmy's got something different because the collection, the evidence is between Timmy and myself. But it gives me an opportunity to create different experiences and to tailor it for my learners. And what I love about this approach is when your students are done with the module or the topic or even your class, they have a collection of evidence that they can use to demonstrate, revisit, and rethink on when they leave your class. That's going to increase the generalization and increase the accessibility of what we do. Now, if you're joining us, I do encourage you to scan that QR code. If you're doing it asynchronously, please do as well. The bit.ly is bit.ly/41 lowercase k, uppercase t, lowercase d, lowercase a, lowercase b as in boy. This takes you to the NCCE Community Collective, where individuals have been gathering their own thoughts about how they design options for perception and representation. I encourage you to access that, take a look at what other people have shared, and add your own insight into what this looks like in your classroom. I always tell people, as teachers, we are really great at borrowing from other teachers. I learn so much from you. I learn so much from every interaction I have with an educator. So this is designed to foster that collaboration, that communication. So I hope that you take advantage of this. We would love to see how you specifically design for representation in your classes. But it's not just all about representation. We know, especially coming up in the next couple of years, the digital side of accessibility is going to be super important. What does it look like for a PDF to be accessible or an image to be accessible? And this is where I'm going to pass it over to my good friend and colleague, Kirsten, who is going to talk to you about exactly that with some concrete tips about what is needed to create those accessible learning experiences.
Thanks, John. I'm excited because I see a lot of overlap when I looked at your slide. So if you saw me getting excited, that was why. It looks like the remote control is paused, so I might need you to click through if you don't mind.
No
Thanks.
problem.
So we are on this slide talking about where UDL and WCAG meet. And this slide shows two paths, two roads. One is universal design for learning, which John so eloquently talked about earlier in the webinar. And then the other side is WCAG 2.1 AA standards, which sounds really scary, possibly to you if you're not familiar. Those are the web content accessibility guidelines, and they're basically just like standards in education. It's the same thing as when we think of standards, there's also accessibility standards. And where those two meet, we get flexible and accessible learning, which is so important. And that is why we've been doing these for the last year, these webinars. And I've been doing these for the last few months. So the good news is we still have almost a full year to get ready for that ADA Title II rule. This applies to all governmental entities. And then during these podcasts, we've been focusing on where they apply to educators specifically. So even if you don't know anything about those WCAG guidelines, you can go back, watch all of the recordings, and you should be good to go for your classroom. And tonight we're going to talk both about supporting students, but also a little bit about supporting parents and other community members, because that's also part of the rule. And again, where those meet. So earlier, John put up really nice visuals of the UDL guidelines. And the middle one he talked about was the language and symbols. And we have two specific guidelines we're going to talk about in relation to WCAG, or that are two specific WCAG standards that relate back to that guideline. And those are 3.1.3, which is to define any unusual words or phrases. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. And then 3.1.5, which is adjusting the reading level. And what's really cool about this is I think you're going to find a lot of this are things that you already do in the classroom. So I hope that means this is going to be an easy night, easier than next month, which is audio description, which is what John talked about previously, describing content on a slide, which is that is my biggest challenge in accessibility. So you're going to see me show you my struggle next time. And then we're also going to just briefly touch on that third area of UDL, which is connecting prior learning to new learning and that background knowledge. And just to show you a little bit more specifics on those WCAG standards, the SC 3.1.3, to kind of break it down, it's avoiding jargon. We want to avoid acronyms, technical language, and provide definitions for any technical terms. And then the next one, 3.1.5, is using that clear, simple language, which again, I heard John talk about earlier during his part. There's so much overlap here between the UDL and WCAG, especially in this section. And then right to accommodate varying literacy levels. So in this section tonight, we're specifically talking about something called cognitive accessibility. So this is going to be for your students that might have ADHD, they might have learning disability, or they might just be really tired that day and they need to reread something again, or they might need it broken down in simpler language. So I'm going to give you a little task on the next slide to read a passage, and then we're going to talk about it. I'm going to give you just about 2 minutes to read this. All right, and we're going to stay here hanging out on this slide for a minute. You may not have had quite enough time to read it. The good news is if you're watching the recording, you can always pause, go back and watch it again, or read it again and have more time. So on this slide, you might have figured out this has to do with the hospital and maybe some job roles in a hospital. And we talked a little bit about that background knowledge and activating prior knowledge and connecting it to new. And this is where if you've had any experience, family members that work in healthcare, experience yourself, hopefully not too often, but going to the hospital, some of this might be familiar to you. But if we worked as a nurse or someone else in the healthcare, this would probably be very simple for us to read. And getting into those standards, we're going to dig in a little deeper, but defining some of those terms would help. And then we're going to do that for you in just a minute. So if you want to click to the next one, John, we'll talk a little more about this. So we're going to dig back into that initial passage, but I'm going to give you another one to read. I'm going to give you a little less time because I think this one's going to be a little simpler for you, especially since you're all educators watching. So I'm going to give you about a minute to read this one. Okay. And full disclaimer, these were generated with AI, but luckily my stepson is about to be a nursing student soon. He's working at Mayo Clinic, so he was able to verify that that was accurate. I hope that was correct because he's not a full nurse yet, but just to let you know. So obviously this one has a bunch of terms that most of us know. There may be a couple here or there that you might not be familiar with, like say PLAF, maybe if you're not in the ESC world, you may not know that one. But because of the context around it, you probably could figure it out because you know the others. But giving this to a group of nurses, this passage would be very challenging for them. Again, unless they might have a child that has an IEP or and they're frequently going to meetings, and they might have a child that goes to occupational therapy, for example. And that's the same thing with us. So that background knowledge really helps, but there are some other things that we want to make sure we put into place. So I'm going to give you a little help now with that next passage. So John, if you can click. So in just a minute, I'll do that. Sorry. So this is the use clear and simple language. So these are the specific things we're going to look at. defining those specialized terms again, abbreviations and acronyms, and then also writing content at that appropriate reading level. And this is the help I'm going to give you. So I didn't define everything for you, but what I did do was define the job roles that were listed in this with a little help again, on which it's a couple I didn't know. So RN, there's a picture here of this gentleman in scrubs with a stethoscope. And RN is the nurse that looks at the patient. Then we have a female doctor here, also with a stethoscope. And it says MD is a medical doctor that advises the nurse. Then we have someone that looks like they're giving some oxygen to a patient, and they have a mask as well. This is the RT, is the respiratory therapist providing care for breathing. And the attending, another female doctor, is the doctor who is assigned to that patient, full doctor, not a resident. And then we also have here the CNA in the teal scrubs is the certified nursing aide assisting the nurse. So knowing just those terms now all apply to job roles, I'm really hoping that this will help you. And we're going to just briefly take a minute to look at that passage one more time on the next slide. I know there's still a few that aren't defined. So for example, for me, knowing that it's respiratory therapist is RT, and I see that stat neb treatment, I can kind of start to figure out a little bit more about what that treatment might be. So that's just one example of how giving those definitions can help. And we're going to just dig a little bit deeper with a strategy that I think will help you on the next slide. And it is called CLEAR, the CLEAR Words Checklist. So this stands for choosing familiar words, listing definitions for unusual words. And I just want to point out that's something that we're probably going to do sparingly. It really depends. If we're sending a newsletter home to parents, most likely we're not going to define the words in the newsletter. We just need to make sure we're using familiar words. But there are times and places where that could be appropriate. E is explain idioms and figures of speech. Again, John talked about this earlier with that bias in language. We can't assume everyone understands like those phrases like it's raining cats and dogs and similar. We need to avoid those or explain them, and especially with visuals. So again, lots of overlap. And then we have A, which is aim for independent reading levels. And then R, repeat key points with visuals or examples. And we're going to just kind of practice a little bit with this checklist for the rest of this webinar now. So here we have a piece of text on the left-hand side of the screen, and it says, evaluate the excerpt and determine the author's underlying premise, then construct a comprehensive response. So we're going to assume this is directions that might be given to maybe a 7th grade class, or even maybe a 9th or 10th grade class of students with learning disability or reading difficulties. So this could be very challenging for them. Just take a look at that on the screen and think about what words we might need to replace with some familiar words, or which words might need to be defined. All right, we're going to click to the next slide. Let's see if yours match mine. So I thought that evaluate, excerpt, determine even possibly, underlying premise for sure, possibly construct depending, and then comprehensive response also. Those are all terms that we might want to replace, at least some of them, in order for students to even understand the directions that we're giving them. So let's look at what that could look like when we flip that. So here's a simplified version. And again, we're addressing that first part of the CLEAR checklist, which is choosing familiar words. So this is simplified, reads, read the paragraph and think about what the author is trying to say. Then write your answer in your own words. And to be honest, even for me right now, that's been working all day and staring at a computer screen, this is so much easier. I'm like, okay, I know what they want me to do. So even as a grown adult with a master's degree, like this is easier for me. So really for anyone, it's just helpful to simplify that language. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to look at the definitions. So in this case, we didn't need to. So we replaced those words, evaluate and with think about. We replaced construct a comprehensive response with write your answer. So we actually didn't need to define those. And again, we want to use that sparingly because we can't always just provide vocabulary. But for example, if I was going to provide an assignment to students with that original set of directions and there was no way to edit that on the fly, then I would definitely want to define those and especially provide visuals for some of those words. And we're skipping through because I didn't see any idioms or figures of speech in there, but we also want to aim for independent reading level. So let's look at how we did. We're going to click to the next slide and see how we did. So we were able to reduce the sentence length with that simplified version. We use common verbs like read, write, and think. And doing that dropped this from a 12 plus reading level down to a 5th grade level, which is really amazing. And we've got one more to look at really quick. So after reading the article, this is another set of directions for students. After reading the article, get to the heart of the matter and present your thoughts in a well-organized format. So looking at that clear checklist, is there anything that jumps out at you? Just take a look and think about anything that really is something that we need to address. All right, we're going to click to the next slide. Hopefully this is what you thought of. So heart of the matter is an idiom or figure of speech. So that is something that we would want to flip. And we're going to see how we can do that on the next slide. So instead, we can say, after you read the article, figure out the main idea, then write what you think in clear sentences. So, and I see in the chat, someone said they didn't even catch that. So that it sometimes can be hard. And I recently have had to be on a call with a vendor that had a lot of individuals from India. And it was pretty obvious that their second language was English. And I didn't realize how often I use idioms until I had to converse with them. And then I would start to say something and I had to keep checking myself. So just like John said earlier, like this is something that we should always be practicing with our students because it comes across all the time. And we really want to be clear in what we're saying so that they understand the directions that we're asking them to do. So excellent. If you caught that one, excellent. If not, it can be tricky. So what I think a lot of you might have been thinking this whole time is that a lot of this is kind of common sense. It's not difficult to do. We were all able to spot those errors, but that's easier said than done. To take everything that we have to present to students or to parents and constantly be looking at simplifying it on our own is very time consuming. So that is where AI comes in and can be very helpful. And then I want to add a little further here. If we can start training students to use it themselves, that is building that independence. Because if they're given a set of directions they don't understand, they themselves can go to the AI and use it to simplify for them. So we're going to take a look at what that would look like. And this model is going to be, actually this model example here is in ChatGPT, but the next one we're going to look at is Copilot. So I showed you with two different tools that are both generative AI. So in this first example, these are the original directions. Similar to what we had earlier, analyze the passage and identify the author's central argument, then compose a well-developed paragraph articulating your interpretation with supporting evidence. And I was remiss to put the prompt here, but I basically just asked them to simplify this for a 5th or 6th grade student. I can't remember which, but one of those grade levels. And this is what ChatGPT spit out for me, which was read the passage, what is the author trying to say, write a paragraph to explain your answer, and give examples from the text, which is so much simpler. And all of you that are listening to the webinar or the recording, if you use Grammarly, if you're like me, you're constantly getting checked by this because they are constantly telling me to simplify my language. And for a long time, it was like we needed to write a flowery language and make things more complicated. Instead of use, I would use utilize all the time. And now it's like keeps changing it back to use. So, and now I've just started to do that naturally in my own writing, which is great. But also using this AI is a great example. So I have on the next slide, I think it's the next slide, we have a little video. Or actually, first I'm going to give you the text. So this was the original directions that we would give to, I would say maybe a 9th or 10th grade class. So I'm going to read that for you, and hopefully you'll see that it is probably not ready to go. So it reads, in this culminating assignment, you will synthesize information from multiple primary and secondary sources to construct a cohesive narrative about an ancient civilization of your choosing. Be sure to incorporate pertinent historical facts, cite your sources appropriately, and demonstrate critical thinking throughout your presentation. Don't forget to go the extra mile to impress your audience. Now, if this was an AP class, with students that were used to having a challenging vocabulary, it might be okay. But in other classes, this could be more challenging. If they had students with disabilities or second language learners, they would need this simplified. So instead of trying to tackle this yourself, we're going to go to Copilot. So let's see what Copilot did for us. Oh, sorry. I forgot about this part. So before we do that, here's just a couple of the words that right away jumped out at me. I just pulled a couple from the first line. So culminating was one I saw, synthesize, but there was a few others. I didn't highlight primary and secondary sources, but that could be challenging if the teacher hasn't already taught that. And then down at the bottom, we have go the extra mile. One of those idioms or figures of speech. I always mix them up, so I'm going to go with either or. And then now we're going to go to the next, and now we're going to see the example. And I think you'll have to hit play, yes. So this is Copilot. You can see I'm entering the prompt there, which is just asking them to simplify so it can be easily understood by 6th grade students, especially if they have a disability, reading disability. And then I just pasted in that prompt. And that is the only prompt I gave. I didn't ask about figures of speech. I didn't ask about a grade level. Oh, I did give the grade level, but that is the only thing I gave. And then here is the result, which is kind of hard to see here in the clip. So we're going to go to the next slide where I've actually provided that there for you. And we'll see how they did. So this is what they generated for us. For your final project, you will gather information from different sources to tell a story about an ancient civilization you choose. Include important historical facts, mention where you got your information, and show what you understood, what you learned. Try to make your presentation interesting and impressive for your audience. So as you can see, it got out those words that I had highlighted, took those out. It also got rid of that idiom or figure of speech, removed that and replaced it automatically without me even having to ask. I can't say that it would always do that, but in this case, it did a really good job. And in a few seconds, I was able to generate that. So again, either doing that yourself or teaching your students to do that. And especially for sending things home to parents, this would be a great thing to show parents as well, so they can help their child be able to do this. And I just have one more slide for you, and that is about humans in the loop. So when we use AI, we always want to make sure that we have a part in this. It is a partner. It is not they're doing your work for you. So for example, the one thing that jumped out at me is it took out primary and secondary sources and just put sources. So if this was just an overview and then I still had, say, a rubric underneath that said primary and secondary sources, then that might be okay. But that's something where, as a teacher, if that's really important, that that's what they're using as their sources and not just saying, I got it at Google, which they do a lot. They think Google's a source. Then that is something that we would maybe want to go back and replace. And if we've extensively talked about primary and secondary sources all year, then I would want to put that back in. And that goes for anything else in here. So we always want to review and make sure that it is fitting the needs of your standards, your class, and just always checking. And that is called that humans in the loop, which is really important. And that is all I have. Until next time.
So you can see, hopefully, we're not talking about reinventing the wheel a lot of times here. We're talking about how do we take what we're doing and rethink to make sure that what we're doing fits as many or as many of our students as possible. That simplification of language, I always laugh because in academia, we're always taught to write a certain way and make ourselves sound so grandiose. But over time, we've realized that is not getting our message out. And so sometimes just taking a step back and thinking about what we're doing, thinking about what we're presenting, thinking about how we're presenting it, and using that thing like artificial intelligence to help ease the burden. We are in 2025. There are so many tools that will take the time away from making these changes and implementing these strategies. It does not have to take you forever. It can be an easy switch. Sometimes it just takes some intention and some knowledge and understanding of how to approach that. And we can make these changes to make our learning experiences more accessible for everybody. So we're so happy that you all were here today. This is our second to last event. We are going to meet you back here next month in June, where we talk about action and expression. We take that a bit further. We encourage you to visit t.ly/_capital V lowercase y 52 to view all of our recordings and to register for the next event. We hope that we will see you there. And again, if you're an organization, a school district, or if you need help with your digital transformation goals, accessibility, inclusivity in the classroom, artificial intelligence, please visit www.ncce.org. We have a team of professional learning specialists waiting and willing to come and help you however you need. So until next month, we are so thankful. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your school year, and we will see you back in June.